When you're building a business, it's about a lot more than a great product or service. Get more with Northwest Registered Agent at northwestregisteredagent.com/paid achiever.
You know you want to start a business. What you may not know is how to make it a reality. GoDaddy got you. Just visit GoDaddy.com to get started. That's GoDaddy.com. Premium features require a paid subscription. See terms on site.
I put a post up on LinkedIn recently about an incredible new study from two economists that found that Gen Z workers who felt they would never be able to afford the house that they wanted in their lives and who were renting had behaviors that correlated with a lot of behaviors that I hear older workers complaining about Gen Z. Not working as hard, right? Not refusing to let their career be their identity, investing in crypto and things that are riskier, and spending more relative to their income and net worth than people who own homes. This made a ton of sense to me. I feel that we have sold younger generations a lie. I wrote this post on LinkedIn to that effect. It got more engagement than anything I've written in a long time. And so I thought that I would bring this episode, and it's actually from 2020, where I interview the journalist Annie Lowrey from The Atlantic about the bill of goods that millennials have been sold in terms of their economic future. And as well, I interview two young people on how they are thinking about and working really hard towards a future that they don't know will be there for them. So if you are looking at housing prices and everything that's going on with layoffs and thinking, how can young people get a leg up? Or if you are someone who's struggling with this, you'll enjoy this episode.
I always knew that I wanted to go to college because I saw education as a gateway to just better myself and achieve whatever the American dream is or what I thought it was when I was younger. So I went away to boarding school when I was in high school, and I was able to get that opportunity through a program called the Oliver Scholars Program, which helps minorities get into private school. I made sure that I did the best that I could and also just tried to be the best, especially as a Black woman. I couldn't really afford to be what I thought was average academically. And I think when I got to Barnard, it shifted away from being not mediocre academically and more so making sure that I wasn't mediocre professionally. And I knew that STEM equaled money. In terms of my mental health, it was definitely a roller coaster. Trying to keep up with my classes while flying out to California for tech interviews. So this past summer, I interned at Groupon as a product manager intern. And when I got back on campus, I found out that I had received a return offer to come back after graduation. There definitely was a moment during this time where I saw that a lot of the people at my company were being furloughed or laid off. And then I went on a Slack channel that was created for new grads who were entering at Groupon. And I saw that our recruiter wrote to us saying that they couldn't guarantee our employment. However, they are very hopeful and they'll keep us posted within the next 30 to 60 days. And I was like, oh my gosh, 30 to 60 days, that's 1 to 2 months. From there, I really kicked back into recruitment mode, and that was definitely just a traumatic experience in itself, just the possibility of not having financial security and stability after graduation. I'm no longer in the limbo. As of 2 weeks ago, they sent out another message saying that our offers are secured and they're just pushing our start dates to October. And my offer should be secure. However, in the back of my mind, I just know how we're really not in control of anything. We might get to September and there's a second wave of COVID, and there are more people who are being furloughed and laid off. The anxiety also comes from me really wanting to hit the ground running and feeling like I've hit the ground running in every environment that I have been in, whether it's going to a boarding school or going to a top college or having great internship experiences, and not having the opportunity to do that right after graduation like I was expecting to have the opportunity to do.
Now, those graduating in 2020 are no doubt facing monumental hurdles as they enter adulthood. But another cohort, Millennials, are now facing the second major economic hit in their adult lives. Many in this group, like the next voice you'll hear, were graduating or just starting out in their careers when the Great Recession hit. Now, many had recovered, had a new life plan, got married, bought homes, were moving up into management, and they were dreaming big, but are now feeling the anxiety of another huge economic shock. Cody Hoyt graduated from high school in 2003 and spent 5 years as a Marine before working in the oil and gas industry, then going back, finishing his undergrad degree, and getting an MBA. Now Cody works at a large public company, but he's also uncertain about how the ground will shift. He sits with his anxiety about the future and whether the big goals he set for himself will ever be in his grasp, given the economy.
For the longest time, I had this idea that I wanted to be this very successful person. And to me, it seemed like successful people were in business. I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania as a middle child. And so while by a lot of accounts, we had a great childhood, one of the really serious things that we dealt with is our mother passed away when I was 14. And once she passed away, my father was the caretaker of our family. And he sort of created a culture in our home that I would consider obnoxiously masculine. And so when it came time to think about post-high school, I'd been kind of exposed to the military in a lot of ways. It was something that I was really interested in doing, but it was also this culture that I was raised in after my mother passed away sort of pushed me in that direction. After that, I chose to leave the military and go into the oil and gas business. And at the time, the price of a barrel of oil is through the roof. It was $140 that summer, which was, if not the historic highs, it was in that ballpark. Shortly after I joined, that $140 a barrel price of oil quickly dropped down to, I think, in the $50 range early that next year. So all the riches I thought I was going to be making in the oil industry quickly evaporated within the first few months I was in the business. And for me, it was this idea that, oh, Jesus, this is the first major failure I've had in my life. I left the oil business to go back to school to finish my undergrad degree. And so I just hoped against hope that after I finished my undergrad and then my MBA, if I was fortunate enough to have, that all work out the way that I wanted to, that the economy would be in a drastically different place and I'd have a chance to sort of hit the reset button a little bit on my career. And when I look at it now, why I think that it was the right decision is what it's given me an opportunity to get myself to a position where I have a steady income, have a really, really decent job. Now I have the opportunity to look and say, okay, what else is out there? What else do I want to do? And I have this really solid footing when people see an MBA, they see something that's successful, somebody that's successful. And so some of those doors that maybe close otherwise because they have those three letters there, people tend to recognize that and are open to maybe discussions that they wouldn't have been otherwise. I was fortunate enough to have an opportunity to sit down with a professional coach through my employer. And he asked me, so tell me what you want to be. And I said, I want to be a CEO of a publicly traded company. And he said, great, tell me why. And I said, to prove that I have fulfilled my potential. And then he said a question I will never forget as long as I live. He said, prove to whom? And until that moment, I had never even thought about what is this idea of success? Why am I chasing so hard and had this idea of success, right? And that has totally shifted the landscape of how I view what I think I want my life to be and what I want to do with my career. Right now, everything's stable, secure. I feel like the work I'm doing is important and meaningful with my employer, but that could change in a heartbeat, and they could decide that we need to cut our staff by half because things aren't looking good. But then there's the anxiety around, as I'm sort of figuring out and thinking through what it is that my future career looks like, it seems like there are fewer options on the table. And then I think the third sort of way I'm feeling some anxiety is, just on the home front. My wife and I were relatively newly married. We're buying a house. We're talking about having children in the near future, and how does everything that's happening in the world affect that, from the pandemic that's still in full effect in the world to the economic situation that we're facing.
Now, I'm a Gen Xer. My generation is known for apathy and trying to figure out our path in life between two huge generations, baby boomers who are older than us and millennials who are younger. U.S. GDP when Gen Xers were in their 20s and 30s grew at twice the level it did for millennials at the same age. Privileged people in Gen X caught the last wave of the days when most white-collar jobs offered health insurance and retirement funds. I also believe, because there was no social media, no university pitch competitions, no obsession with entrepreneurship or creating the next big startup, no LinkedIn or TED Talks, we had less pressure to be awesome when we were starting out. The combination of less economic pressure and less social pressure meant we had more room to find our ways into our careers. That's just not true anymore. And the stories we've just heard are, of course, two individuals at different stages of life in different parts of the country. Many more people their age are suffering as well, many having lost jobs or failed to get one out of college. So we also wanted to explore the collective impact of an event like this on a generation. We turn now to Annie Lowrey, staff writer at The Atlantic. She recently wrote the piece, Millennials Are the New Lost Generation, and I spoke with her about the economic, psychological, and social impacts a major economic crisis can have. Annie, I'd love it if you just give a rundown for listeners. What kind of long-term impacts the last recession, the Great Recession of 2008 onward, had on different generations, but especially millennials?
Yeah, so recessions as a general point don't hit all cohorts in the same way. They're bad for everybody, but there are some ways in which they are particularly bad for young people. And we saw that borne out with millennials and the Great Recession. And we are likely seeing it being borne out with Gen Zers and the pandemic recession that we're in right now. Millennials graduated into the worst labor market since the 1930s. And so they took large initial job losses. Their unemployment rates were very high, even compared to the overall unemployment rate, which peaked at about 10%. But for millennials was, depending on where you were and your education level, was in some cases more like 30%.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, bad. So large initial job losses, earnings losses, and then those scars took a long time to fade. Actually, millennials are still carrying them. Economic research indicates that graduating into a recession leads to these kind of big earning losses at the beginning, and even 2 decades later, you still have earnings losses. And so the economic term for this is hysteresis. And it's sometimes described as labor market scarring. So basically graduating into a recession leaves a scar. It takes a very long time to fade. And in some cases doesn't really fade for your whole lifetime. It's sort of a permanent effect. And so then there's kind of all these sort of second order knock-on effects that happened because of just, the bad timing that the millennials ended up with. So one is that they were really unable to buy homes or bought homes a lot later than Gen Zers or baby boomers did. So even right now, millennials, their rate of homeownership is like 8 percentage points lower than compared to prior generations. So that's a huge loss. They struggled to accumulate wealth, in part because they took on so much student loan debt, more than $500 million for just the millennials themselves, and in part because they had these kind of sluggish earnings trajectories. They were slower to move out into single family homes. They had fewer kids. They started fewer businesses because they didn't have the financial capacity to.
Hmm.
So millennials got dealt a pretty crummy hand, and we're really worried. I'm really worried that that's kind of happening to Gen Z too.
What do you think, just sort of extrapolating, will be the effect of having back-to-back generations? So you've got the millennials who now have hit a double whammy, and then Gen Z who are graduating into a huge economic mess. What will be the effect of having back-to-back generations that have just been clobbered?
It's not good. And you've seen, so I know you guys have talked about, and we as a society have talked a lot about income inequality and wealth inequality becoming unbelievably predominant features of American economic life. And the truth is that wealth inequality and income inequality manifests itself in terms of a kind of age inequality also. So baby boomers experienced really different financial conditions than younger people did. They had a really big leg up. They were in their peak earning years during times when, even with recessions, sort of the tide was lifting all boats. And younger folks, they haven't benefited in that same way. And I think that is going to have a lot of effects just in terms of our understanding of who the American economy works for and who it doesn't. One sort of interesting strand to draw out of this is that having a recession happen to fall during your formative years, which happened for both millennials and Gen Zers, it tends to decrease your confidence in public institutions like Congress, but it actually tends to increase your social solidarity. So your support for redistributive government programs like Social Security, like food stamps. And so I think that that's actually a really important part of the kind of leftward drift
Hmm.
that we've seen among young people, that they're like, man, we need a social solution, a societal solution to these problems because the economy isn't working for us. And we're making up this giant precariat despite having really done everything right, done everything that we were told to do.
I mean, that's the thing, right? I mean, it's interesting because, of course, the stereotype is that millennials and then Gen Z are so entitled. They feel all their feelings and everyone just constantly hovers all over them. But my sense as a Gen Xer is that certainly the two younger people we'll hear from today on the show, Cody and Daria, they could not have done more to make themselves seem perfect on paper. The drive, the checking the boxes of ambition that I see among millennials and Gen Z who are professionally driven blows me away as a sort of, lackadaisical Gen Xer who just drifted and found her way into success because it was easy. That's got to create like a very emotional disconnect for these people who have done everything right and yet are totally screwed by the system and, the American dream of raising up a rung in the ladder. When you're building a business, it's about a lot more than a great product or service. It's about your total business identity, which is like your legal paperwork and the fact that your website is secure and state licenses. Well, Northwest Registered Agent can help you get more for your business. More privacy, more tools, more guidance. And they've been helping entrepreneurs launch and grow businesses for nearly 30 years. They're the largest registered agent and LLC service in the US, with over 1,500 corporate guides who are real people who know your local laws and can help you and your business every step of the way. For just $39 plus state fees, you can get an LLC, domain name, business email, a local phone number, business address, registered agent, and compliance in just 10 clicks and 10 minutes. You can get your business formation paperwork as well. Northwest makes life easy for business owners. Don't wait. Protect your privacy, build your brand, and get your complete business identity in just 10 clicks and 10 minutes. Visit northwestregisteredagent.com/paid achiever and start building something amazing. Get more with Northwest Registered Agent at northwestregisteredagent.com/paid achiever.
Absolutely. I find it frankly offensive when you see these arguments about how this is, millennials' entitled attitude and their avocado toast and they expect too much in the workplace, yada, yada, yada. Individual level explanations, right? Like explanations for what has happened to this cohort that rest on some sort of intrinsic emotional factors within the cohort are just ridiculous.
Right.
Millennials didn't get anything handed to them, and they did everything kind of right. They were told, the path to the middle class to security is through education. And so they're the most educated cohort in American history. And what do they get for that? They get a lot of student loans, and they get suppressed wages and the inability to accumulate wealth, right? Like this is a cohort that wasn't taking drugs, like the Gen X.
I did.
This was a cohort that delayed having children. There's really compelling economic research that shows that in order to make up for initial earnings losses, you have to switch jobs because it's actually, big raises don't tend to come from staying in the same job and advancing. They come from moving between companies. And that's another thing that always bothers me in the kind of millennial, right? Like, oh, they're just job hopping. And it's like, well, maybe they're doing that because they need to make more money. So that's another part of it that, and I suppose that, there's this kind of similar, now like, okay, boomer attitude about, how the boomers ruined everything, which I think is in some ways also overplayed. But yeah, this is not a problem that has to do with choices millennials made. It has to do with the structures that they're operating in.
What about innovation? I think about that too. I wonder if the cost of not trusting institutions and financial systems and having so little stability stifles, not that's a negative word, changes your attitude towards wanting to go out and innovate and take risks and start businesses in favor of seeking safety. I mean, do we know anything about that?
We know that the people who get to become entrepreneurs often are people from high income backgrounds because they have that kind of parental safety net. Maybe they have, less student debt. Maybe they just know that the worst thing that can happen is that they have to move home. And so maybe also, right, like they get loans from their parents and their parents' friends to start their business or, like the credit card that somebody will co-sign with them.
Friends and family.
Exactly. And so, that means to me that actually having more family security, a bigger middle class, higher net worths for middle income families would actually really help with entrepreneurship. We could say societally that we want everybody to have that kind of to fall back on. And there are policies that can get us there.
Are there other social or psychological effects you're thinking about that we may see coming out of the Great Recession and of course now the unknown size recession/depression of the pandemic?
There are really interesting studies of kids who grew up in the Great Depression and again, just recessions are bad. They're bad for health. They're bad for income. They're just bad for everybody. And that's why it's such an urgent public policy concern to make sure that they're as short and as mild as possible. But insofar as there are kind of interesting silver linings that come out of them, I think that social solidarity is one of them. There's interesting studies of kids who grew up in the Depression that show that in some cases it inculcated a lot of grit. I've always been interested in that, to what extent some people come out with sort of this additional resilience. but it's hard, right? We know that recessions even have intergenerational effects. So the children of kids who experienced a recession in their formative years have lower earnings than people who missed that recession just slightly, which is, I always find that kind of crazy.
Wow.
And it just makes it so urgent to try to fix these things and to try to make sure that the safety net is working for people.
I want to ask you specifically about the emotional and psychological impact of debt, because I think
Yes.
that is something that is, I know personally, it induces a kind of anxiety that lack of forward opportunity just doesn't, because debt literally hangs over you. It follows you. You can't escape it. It can feel insurmountable. What role is the burden of debt going to play, both psychologically and financially, on people sort of under 40 today?
We are running this grand experiment on the psychology of debt and young people. So again, the message was go to school, and it's going to lead to these income and wealth accumulation benefits. It's all going to work out for you. And so young people, starting in the 80s and 90s, right? Like they just started taking on more debt to go to school. Their families took on more debt. And the financial part of it, in a lot of cases, didn't actually work out that well. It is true that there's a huge earnings premium associated with going to college, but it's now gotten so expensive. And in some cases, earnings trajectories have been crummy enough that the benefit isn't that big. And if you look for young Black folks, there used to be a huge wealth benefit in terms of going to college, and now there's almost none, right? It's so expensive to go, and accumulating wealth as a younger person has become so challenging and so difficult. You spend $25,000, $30,000 going to school, and the math doesn't always work out very well. And in terms of the psychology, I think that we in some ways sort of underrated the emotional effects of having this additional bill to pay for like decades on end, and how fraught that makes your financial decision making. So like even if a personal finance expert could look and say, hey, the math worked out for you, this is better, that psychology of, man, I need to pay my rent and it's really costly, and I got to pay my kids' childcare and it's really costly, and also I'm still paying $400 or $600 a month on my student loans. You look at surveys and it's just so burdensome for people, and I feel like that's actually a really underrated part of this. The fact that from the outset of your adult life, you're just kind of saddled with this, you feel like you're just constantly spooning water out of the boat.
Well, I think that's right. And humans being humans, we always, I think, intrinsically think the future will be better. And so, we have a sense, thank God, that opportunity might just be around the corner, so that, like you said, even if you're paying a ton of money for childcare now, you can see it as an investment in future growth. But debt closes off the part of your brain in a way that allows you to feel creative and free and innovative and look ahead to what's big. It is literally, I think, it almost creates a trauma, because when you think about an adventure, in your career, you're triggered by that feeling of, oh my gosh, but I owe, and I have to make that every month.
Absolutely. And it really weighs on you psychologically. I would be really interested to know how it reduces people's risk taking, right? Like maybe I'm not going to go start that podcast or begin a business or, quit my job and do this thing that I've always wanted to do educationally or in business or whatever it might be, because that bill is just endlessly due.
I wanted to ask a question going back to the value of college. If you see a sort of inflation in the need to have credentials in order to make it up. I'm thinking of a study that was done last year by Forte Foundation, which looked at the value of an MBA, right? So, I was always raised that if you had an MBA, you were golden, right? It was an investment. It was expensive, but like, wow. But what they found is that the future earnings potential of MBAs has shrunk. It's, of course, surprise, surprise, biggest for white men. It's significant for African Americans of both genders. It's actually sort of net neutral for women, white women especially, because I think of dropping out of the workforce. But it does strike me that gap is narrowing. The value is less. We know that the value of getting a law degree or a medical degree is less because of debt, because earnings but again, I think that, 20 years ago, my mother would always say this: when I grew up, a BA was all you needed. And now you need a doctorate to be a physical therapist, an occupational therapist. What's that inflation going to cost us in terms of credentialing?
This kind of credentialism has all sorts of terrible downsides. First of all, I think, still getting an advanced degree, at least on paper, for most people, right? So an average really, really helps. And we have seen stratification in terms of income on the basis of education because we've seen the erosion, the loss of these kinds of jobs. There are just fewer of them, particularly in manufacturing, that kind of thing, where you don't need a college degree, but it's a stable middle class job. We especially see the kind of bad effects of this sort of credentialism when you have a recession and a really bad labor market. Employers basically, they have too many people to pick from for, individual jobs when they're hiring. And so they do this kind of inflation where they say, oh, for this job, we've decided now that you need a master's, not just a BA, or you need a BA, not just a GED. And in that way, they're kind of winnowing their pool down. And this is a really harmful, hurtful thing in the economy. And you can see it in lots of ways. And again, this is kind of one reason that it's just so important for the country to sort of get to full employment and stay there, because it takes a long time for income gains to reach folks who are lower down the income ladder. This was something we saw after the last recession, and it's going to be really important going forward.
I want to talk about the media for a second. You're a member of the media. What do you think the media is doing right about covering the generational financial crises now? And what could they do in order to help craft a public narrative that is helpful both for job seekers and employers? What is the role of media in all this?
It's such a great question. And it's coming, during this time that, for all that we've seen kind of this wonderful explosion and this creation of media where the barrier to entry is really low. So RIP blogs, but it's been so great to see podcasting explode as a phenomenon. And net, I think, Twitter has been terrible for humanity, but I do actually think in some ways it's been good for news consumption, maybe. And, we're in this crisis of just the number of news outlets collapsing and the number of reporters. The Atlantic itself went through really painful layoffs last week. There's this structural crisis. That said, I'm totally with you that narrativization is such a dangerous thing. So if we were talking 10 years ago, this narrative that the millennials were lazy basement dwellers was becoming really predominant.
Or
really
obsessed
fruitful
with starting apps that had little societal value, and yet, right, that was another narrative.
Yeah. Another narrative that slightly drives me crazy and where I do think that the media constantly gets it wrong is that there's this kind of, how do you put it? There's this real fetishization of garage tech startups, when really most entrepreneurship and small business creation in the United States, it's not like primarily tech and apps and stuff,
Nope.
right? It's people setting up small law offices or starting nail salons. It's much less sexy and exciting, but it's still really important. And I think we kind of constantly flub that one. And I think that you're right that there's just this like total fetishization of especially Silicon Valley, and everything's getting disrupted and everything's changing. And this inability to see tech for like what it was, which was just another industry acting in its own self-interest and like selling this narrative about itself.
Dominated by white men who kept money among white men. Yeah.
Totally. And that they're all like monopolists,
Mhm.
right? Who now like do a lot of like lobbying in Washington. And I always felt like if you just treated, like if you replaced tech with oil and gas, would you get the same like gasping media coverage about all these geniuses who are disrupting and changing the whole world? And so, yeah, I am with you that like that kind of clear-headedness. And I get that, you know, there's all this like social psychology about people want new things and they want heroes, and, you know, media is like creating these anyway. I wish I were clear-eyed enough to know what we were just totally messing the story up on now. I try, but I'm not sure.
Well, I think most journalists are just trying to keep their jobs. You know, my husband always cites the statistic that, you know, the steel industry has actually kept many more jobs. Journalists have lost about 5 times more jobs as the steel industry over the past 20 years, but we never talk about that. You know, it's funny though, Cody, who is part of this episode, I heard in his voice a real almost grief because he's in corporate America, and I think he is so of the entrepreneurship porn generation that he feels like he's missing a benchmark in a way by not blazing that trail of glory.
Yeah, I think that sense of loss is really palpable, and also the way in which it's just become really hard to do, right? Like we are seeing this declining entrepreneurship rate across the whole of the economy. Again, this is a structural thing, and I don't think we even entirely understand it. But it's so amazing to see that reflected in an individual who has this yearning, right, to do it.
And who did everything right.
Exactly.
Served in the
Like,
military,
what
got
the-
an MBA. Like it's just, I think that saying it's structural is the key. It's not individual X's fault. It's not your fault that you're not Mark Zuckerberg, right? Like there are structural forces, right? That I hear you saying that.
Absolutely. And I imagine that it's, you know, I never went to business school myself, right? But I imagine that pressure to do it yourself is really prevalent in business school, where at least,
Beyond.
you know, like folks who I know who have gone or who teach at them, right? There's all this emphasis on the new and the transformative. And as you point out, not on the, you know, creating from within or realizing that this has gotten a lot harder and that there's deep financial reasons, both at the household level and in terms of corporate financing, why that's true.
Well, Annie Lowrey, I want to thank you so much for your work and for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's it for this week's show. If you like the show, follow us and tell your friends. And please leave us a review. It really helps the anxious achiever get found by people just waiting for our content. I'm your host, Maura Aarons-Mele. Lots more to come in the next episode.